Mr. Tobias, greetings and nice to see you on First Western.
Good to be here, thank you.
So it's a year since Russia started its illegal full-scale invasion of Ukraine. I would like to speak with you about 24th of February last year. How did you find out about invasion of Russia? What did you feel, and what was the atmosphere in British Parliament on that day?
Well, I was actually in Kyiv leading up to a week before the invasion. And I then went to the Munich Security Conference directly after that. And once that conference finished, that's when the invasion took place. And I think it took everybody by surprise. They didn't believe that a modern state such as Russia could do this in the 21st century. And I think a year later, we now realize the penny is dropping just how serious this is. This isn't about a skirmish in Eastern Europe to do with Ukraine. This is far bigger than Ukraine. This is about Russia reinventing the rules-based order, perhaps aligning itself with China. There's some bigger issues at play here. A permanent member of the United Nations, P5 member, invades another country, and then another permanent member, China, does not condemn it. And then the other three permanent members, France, Britain, and the United States, can't fully agree on what to do. And we know we've entered a new era of insecurity.
This war changed the life of every Ukrainians, but how did the resistance of our army change the world and international world order, in your opinion?
Well, I mean, firstly, huge respect for the Ukrainian people to want to fight. I think you took everybody by surprise. And we've had to play catch up. We've had to provide the weapon systems to you. But even that, we've been hesitant. It's taken us a whole year to give you main battle tanks. And now we still argue about whether to give you air power or not. So we've allowed you to do the fighting. And we've not clarified what victory means. And yet we should appreciate, whilst this is devastating to Ukraine, the challenge that the West has is to realize that this is not just about Ukraine. The inflation in the UK, had the war not happened, would be at 4%. Instead, it's at 11%. That's because the grain can't get out of Odessa. It means also because of the energy crisis as well. So this is having huge economic consequences right across Europe, and as well as security consequences as well. So it's in our collective interests to do more to be able to support Ukraine. We have some challenges here. We have a spring offensive, which you're going to face. We know it's coming, but we're not sure how to give you the military assistance that you need. You know, Putin is in it for the long game. That he wants a frozen conflict. That's what benefits him. We're not sure quite what to do about that. And then we're starting to realize that this is more about Russia versus the West. And how do we then contain and contest a new Cold War? Some difficult questions for the West to now deal with.
Speaking about Western support of Ukraine, I would like to speak with you about NATO role in this situation, in the war. Last year, our government asked NATO to establish no-fly zone over Ukraine, but unfortunately, military alliance refused to do it. But you supported this idea to establish no-fly zone over Ukraine. Also, you said that NATO troops in Ukraine should be considered. In your opinion, could NATO in any moment in the future maybe establish a no-fly zone over Ukraine, or decide to support our forces from the sky, or even deploy its own troops on the ground? And what do you think personally about it?
So, such important questions. Firstly, I encourage NATO to send its mobilization force before the invasion, to actually be able to look Putin in the eye and say, listen, you're not just taking on Ukraine, you're taking on NATO itself to prevent invasion in the first place. This would have been like the Cuban Missile Crisis moment, I think. But how all the challenges and issues and destruction that we've now seen it could have all been prevented had we done that. But no, NATO's limitations have been exposed because of Turkey and because of Hungary. Even Finland and Sweden joining the alliance is not immediately possible because of the consensus that's required in NATO. So I think it should be a long-term objective for Ukraine to join NATO. But now I would say a better alliance to join, which could happen immediately, is the Joint Expeditionary Force, the JEF. This is something that exists already. It's many NATO countries are there, and I would strongly urge Ukraine to apply for membership of the Joint Expeditionary Force. This is what could be done to support you more militarily and not be hindered by the political limitations that NATO is now suffering from.
But how it could help us to win the war? I know that you said this point in your plan, how to end the war. You presented this plan in House of Commons. But how UK Joint Expeditionary Force could help us to win the war, to beat Russian troops?
So firstly, it sends a strong message to Putin to say that there is an alliance there that's willing to do more than NATO, because NATO formally is not participating at all. It is sitting on the bench because of Hungary and Turkey. So it's an individual countries, the coalition of the willing, but that could be better coordinated through the Joint Expeditionary Force. So for that to happen, it would require Ukraine and I think Poland as well to join that. And that could help better coordinate the military assistance that we need. But you also need a strategy. We need clarity as to what the mission is. And for me, the mission is the liberation entirely of Donbass and the liberation entirely of Crimea, return to a sovereign Ukraine. If any part of Ukraine is still occupied by Russia, it means that your economy cannot thrive. Your security cannot be guaranteed. It means that Russia will probably do this again in a couple of years' time. And I should, articulate my message at the Munich Security Conference. Let's learn from this and help Moldova today, because they are now extremely vulnerable indeed. We should be again placing troops, assets, support in Moldova, giving them everything they need, because this is the bigger picture that we face. It is Russia wanting to redraw the map of Eastern Europe to increase its influence into the former Warsaw Pact countries. That's what it's intending to do. And it's playing on how risk-averse the West has been, how timid that we've become. We've lost the statecraft skills that we once had during the Cold War.
I would like to switch on to Downing Street politics. As you might know, UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak announced delivering to Ukraine long-range capabilities. So are we going to receive Storm Shadow cruise missiles or long-range Brimstones?
I think it's really important that you have these long-range missiles. I mean, there are 4 components that Ukraine requires. First is air defense, like Patriot air systems, HIMARS, Starstreaks, and things like that. These are important to keep the skies clear. You need the long-range missiles themselves to push back Russian forces back into their own territory. That keeps them at bay. It keeps their own artillery further back. You then need the hard power, which is the military, the main battle tanks, to start regaining territory, showing the West that you are starting to win this battle, punching through the Russian defense lines. That's why you need the main battle tanks. The main battle tanks require top cover, and that's why you need air power, the final component. Now, I think in the long term, it would make sense to choose one single platform. The F-16 would be the most sensible. But there are other ways that you can actually give the top cover that the tanks need. The A-10 Thunderbolt, for example, the Super Tucano. There are UAVs, drones that can provide similar assets too. The call for fast jets, I understand, but it takes a few years to get the pilots up to the necessary skill sets. But there may be MiGs that could come from other countries as well. But ultimately, we need to start thinking more strategically about long-term security, providing Ukraine with what it needs. I would like to see some weapons factories built in the neighboring countries, but with Ukrainians inside. That way you can start building your own weapon systems in Eastern Poland, for example. You know, Taiwan has got a microchip factory in Arizona now. Why? Just in case China does something silly, you know, around that island, that they can keep producing the world's microchips. You need to be able to produce, you know, the weapon systems that you need. But clearly, if you build a factory in Ukraine, it's likely to be bombed by Russia, not today, not tomorrow, in 6 months or a year's time. So we need to start thinking about continuity and about security and about resilience.
You presented the idea of massive arms factory in Eastern Poland in House of Commons, but why it is so important to build such factory now to help our soldiers?
Well, firstly, we can continue absolutely giving you the weapon systems from our own stocks. That can't go on forever. We are running out right across Europe. The NATO Secretary General said this, that our stockpiles are going low. So we have to start creating more for ourselves. And then Ukraine needs its own sources of supply as well. So we should get the defense companies building these things, but using Ukrainian skills. So you then have the skill sets, the capabilities to then build them yourselves, but in the safety of inside the NATO area.
I would like also to speak with you about this plane issue. As you know, Downing Street announced a training program for our pilots to teach them how properly use Western jets. But then, unfortunately, UK Defence Minister Ben Wallace said that this program could be completed after the end of the war, and we can receive Eurofighters at the end of the conflict. So when will this training program begin, and will Downing Street, in your opinion, go on with fighter jets for Ukraine?
Well, as I stress, it takes a long time to train a fighter pilot. It takes up to 3 to 4 years. Sometimes it takes up to 7 years because the programs, everything they need to do doesn't happen sequentially. So we need to bear that in mind. That's why I'm saying we need to be able to give you air power assets. Talk about air power rather than simply the platforms themselves like fast jets. So yes, we want to get Ukrainian cadets into our flight schools, not just in the UK, but the United States and right across NATO, to provide that support, to get your pilot training beginning. And a lot of it is very simple, you know, basic training that's done in Tucanos, Super Tucanos, and so forth, as I mentioned. So we can start that immediately, and I think that's what's happening in Britain and indeed in other countries.
Your plan how to end the war in Ukraine also consists of one point regarding the personal sanction against Putin. You propose personally sanction Putin and froze his assets in the world. But do you think it will be really effective? Because the United States, the European Union, Great Britain have already imposed lots of sanctions against Russia, but unfortunately it didn't yet help to end the war.
You raise such an important point, because only about 35 countries in the world joined in with the sanctions, you know, out of 198 or whatever the number now is of you know, legitimate countries and organizations. So there are still too many countries that are sitting on the fence. So the status quo is not working. We need to encourage more people, particularly countries like India, like South Africa, like Brazil, to recognize that actually what Russia is doing as a senior member of the United Nations, invading another country, is wrong. And that should be called out. And if it's not called out, it means that the bully is seen to succeed, that authoritarianism, aggression is rewarded. So that's why there are some bigger geopolitical questions for the world to recognize and deal with and grapple with. And that is so important, why we are able to put this fire out in Ukraine as quickly as possible as an exemplar of what happens when one country is illegally invaded. If I just may mention another point, which is so critical, and it saddens me that we've not made progress on this, and that's in the port of Odessa. It is Russia that's determined the rules there. The deal was, you know, crafted by Russia. Why is the bully determining how much grain can come out of Odessa. Just 1/5 of the grain comes out. I visited the port a couple of times now in the last 6 months. And I think we can get a better deal. We can provide a maritime force separate from NATO, a neutral force that's able to get the grain out to feed Africa, to feed Europe, and help Ukrainian economy. But still, we're stuck with an old deal that's been determined by Russia. Russia should have no part in this. And it's an example, I'm afraid, of the West responding to what Russia does. Russia setting the agenda and the West responding rather than us setting the agenda and then recognizing that Russia may respond, but it's us that's going to stand up, to the bully.
So you would rather send a military fleet to Black Sea than about Russia deal, but which countries could consist of that fleet to help us to export grain? This coalition could be led by Great Britain?
I'm sure Britain could help coordinate it, but this would be better to be a neutral force. Countries like Egypt, for example, Bangladesh, there's countries that do a lot of work with the United Nations as part of the Blue Helmets. So a neutral force that's supported by the United Nations, endorsed by the General Assembly, made up of African Union countries, for example, that could help be seen to make sure that they are only getting grain out of the country and nothing to do with the war itself. Because if it's NATO were involved in that, Russia could understandably accuse those ships from bringing weapon systems into Odessa at the same time. And we wouldn't want that. We'd want this to be purely a neutral force designed to help on a humanitarian basis, designed to help the world get the grain that it needs from Ukraine.
So that's the reason why NATO didn't close the sky over Ukraine. They're afraid of accusing of the involvement in the war.
Well, many reasons why. Firstly, you couldn't get agreement by NATO. Like I said, it's a consensus-driven organization. And Hungary and Turkey are not interested in standing up to Russia. They simply won't. In the same way that they have not approved Sweden and Finland from joining. This is dragging on for a year now. Why is it taking so long to do something so simple? It shows you that NATO is paralyzed because of that. So it's individual NATO countries that are having to step forward. And that takes me back to the Joint Expeditionary Force, which does not include Turkey or Hungary, and therefore can be far more assertive in providing support for Ukraine, in coordinating that effort.
Also, last year you said that any damage made to Ukrainian nuclear power station causing radiation will be a violation of Article 5 of NATO statute. So only in case of Russian nuclear escalation, NATO could be involved in the war, support our forces.
Well, again, this is a great example that NATO could have taken advantage of the situation, have been more proactive in recognizing that there are nuclear power stations that were being attacked. And that would have been an opportunity to ring fence these power stations, take them out of the war, making sure they can still work to provide the necessary electricity from a humanitarian support. But instead, we were reluctant to step up. We were hesitant to want to look Russia in the eye. We've been spooked by the rhetoric that Putin has come out with because he mentions nuclear weapons all the time. And we really the West needs to develop more of a backbone. And it's been quite symbolic. It's taken a full year to get tanks onto the battlefield from the West. That is far too long.
And if you were NATO General Secretary, for example, would you go on with no-fly zone over Ukraine or some stronger decisions?
Well, a no-fly zone is a tactic. It has to fit into a strategy. So no-fly zone also means that Ukrainians can't fly either. It means you take out the airspace completely. So it has to be for a purpose. It has to be part of a wider package, a strategy to bring the war to a close. Now, what's actually happened is that you've created a no-fly zone effectively because of what has been good is the amazing air defense systems that have been provided for Ukraine. But it still won't stop the missiles coming through or the missile attacks as well. Ultimately, I think we need to be looking at providing greater air air power. And I use that word carefully, air power rather than fighter jets, because that's what you require. And we can, that's through Apache helicopters, A-10s, as I mentioned before. Very, very, very powerful aircraft, but it's an older aircraft, but it could be used in the interim. You could train these pilots in a matter of months and then get these assets working in the skies, protected, as I say, by incredible air defense. We haven't seen Russia use its air force, understandably, because of the amazing air defense. So that means we can take advantage of that. But it's the battle of the tanks that's going to be important, to punch through Russian defenses, to retake ground on a counterattack. That is what we need to be working towards. These are the assets that we now need. That's what Ukraine requires.
And my last question for you will be about security guarantees of Ukraine. There are lots of discussion on this topic, and UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak on Munich Security Conference said that NATO should pledge security guarantees to Ukraine by July this year. How would such security guarantees look like for Ukraine?
Britain has done, I think, an incredible job in pushing the envelope, in pushing the ability, the desire of NATO to do more collectively. But it's been very difficult indeed for all the reasons that we've been discussing. So I was pleased that the British Prime Minister, that Rishi Sunak, was looking at what comes next. How can we provide a longer term guarantee for Ukraine? Because don't forget, Russia will simply do this all again in a couple of years' time unless it is deterred by a strong Ukraine that's part of a wider alliance or gains guarantees from an alliance. So I do hope this is something that NATO countries will support. My fear is that Turkey and Hungary will again say no to this. So for the third time, I say that's where the Joint Expeditionary Force could provide that same guarantee and act with the same assets as well and be just as good as standing up to Russia.
Thanks for being with us today and your time, Mr. Tobias, and glory to Ukraine.
Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава. Thank you.